Hello, and welcome to the MKG podcast, where we help demand gen marketers grow their company's business through SEO, digital advertising, and analytics. At MKG, we hire experts, and to help me introduce today's guest, I have digital advertising expert Liz Johnson on with me. Liz, hello.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Doing well.
So Liz, you've already listened to today's podcast, and from any takeaways, do you think any of our current clients would benefit from upfront user research?
Yeah, doing user research with new existing clients, really finding out pain points or reasons new clients came on board. Why did you choose our product over other people? Did you know about network detection response? Did you know about what we do? Or even with existing clients, what parts of the interface could be more intuitive, or what could be easier to use? What would you like us to expand on? Just product development in general. So yeah, I think absolutely.
Yeah, and that's talking to existing clients, which I think is definitely powerful to learn about all those whys. And something that our guest talks about today is also brand net new people and people who've maybe never heard of your product, and getting, their initial response to not only the product itself, but the industry too, what their pain points are just as a whole, and then being able to find out what those are up front as you develop the product and pivot and learn, which I thought was interesting too. But for you, Liz, from the digital advertising world, this would really help with messaging, right? When you're writing ad copy and figuring out how to get out in front of people.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest things in writing ad copy is identifying pain points and identifying creating solutions. What are users looking for? So absolutely.
So today's guest is a good friend of mine, Steve Kesselman from Do Feel Think. Steve started his own consulting business helping brands build their products with the help of qualitative and quantitative user research. So we are going to find out how Steve has spun up his own company and why, and what kind of brands he's helped and how he has helped them. I found it really inspiring. I got to work with him a couple times, watching user research sort of unfold, and it is pretty magical, I have to say. So let's hear from Steve.
So Steve, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is so exciting. So you have been doing research for brands for how long, do you think?
Oh gosh, 10, 15 years. I don't know. It makes me feel old.
Hardly. Steve and I met probably 8 years ago at a company where you were doing research on behalf of brands, but you've recently, last 3 or 4 years, broke out to do your own company.
I did, yes. Yeah. I feel like when you do something for a long time, you start to rise in the ranks and you start doing more management and you move a little bit away from the work, and I kind of missed that. So I struck out on my own and hung out my shingle so that I could get a little bit closer to the work and a little bit closer to my clients again.
And who are your clients right now, in terms of not necessarily the name of the brands or anything, but sort of paint us a picture of your client, your ideal client?
Yeah, sure. I think I can mention some of their names too. I think that's okay. So my work tends to be on a project basis. But in the last 2 years, I've done projects for Spotify. I've done projects for U.S. soccer, colleges, and universities. And then also in the tech space, I've done some work with tech startups. I would call them startups, but they're well-funded startups. They're sort of well on their way, and they're sort of staffed up. And at that point, they're sort of exploding in growth. And once they start to do that, then they realize, oh, we should really think about our brand. We should understand our customer a bit better, because often in the tech space, often it starts with a technology or an idea that's really useful and valuable. But it's not necessarily a full business idea with how you're going to sell and message that. And when you start to staff up on the sales team, everyone starts to have their own way of talking about the product or the brand. And you might start to learn from that, but at some point you're going to want everybody to sort of speak with a similar voice and a similar message. so that the customers and prospects out in the marketplace are thinking of you in one way.
And I mean, there's a couple ways that you can certainly get there. And Mike and I actually, his partner and I just went through something called Traction, which has been really useful, where we actually go through this whole process of, thinking some of those things through. But it's been a lot of work, and we've also been around for 7 years. So I think we have a little bit of a handle on sort of where we want to go and who we are at this point. But for companies who are in that sort of early stage and that growth stage, who are still trying to find their footing, and I've worked with startups too, where I feel like every day was different and every day they were pivoting. And so which doesn't really help, right? You sort of want to place a stake in the ground and say, this is who we are and this is what we stand for. So how do you help brands sort of get to that stake faster than the 7 years it's taken Mike and I?
Yeah, sure. And before we go into sort of how you stay consistent, I will say there is definitely something to pivoting. I'm currently talking to a company in the cannabis sector, which is a huge growth sector right now in the US. And I haven't worked in that space before, but so I'm talking to a lot of founders, and a lot of them are saying that they started their business thinking they were one thing and they became something else. So there's definitely something to the pivot and being flexible. I think that that's something, a smaller business or a newer business can be more nimble than a bigger business that's been in a space for a long time and has a lot of infrastructure built up. But all of that said, you do want to do most things with purpose, right? So you might pivot, but until you decide to pivot, it is good to know what you're building towards. One other thing that I'd mention, I worked with Vonage quite some time ago when they were a startup, when they had those fun ads on TV. And when we went in and talked to them, so part of a brand strategy process, often we'll do interviews with people who lead different departments and different disciplines. And as that company had grown so fast, the different departments were feeling siloed, and they had different goals and different missions that didn't necessarily align into one mission. So sometimes when a company grows, like you and Mike, it sounds like, you're a smaller organization, you've been feeling things out over 5 to 7 years, and you sort of come to consensus. But if a company grows really, really large, really fast, like some of these companies in the tech space, different departments might start to have different paths they're going down, and they're not all driving towards the same point. And so that's another really valuable reason to sort of do this brand strategy work and make sure that people across the organization are aligned. So all of that said, you were sort of asking about how you come to that focused message, or how you come to that space. So that is one of the things that I do with clients most often, using research to articulate the message. So in a brand strategy project, that will usually manifest in articulating the mission, the vision, and the values of the company. And then typically the positioning, which is sort of a marketing term for how you want the customer, the consumer, your prospective clients to think about you, the space that you hold in their mind, the position you hold in their mind and in the competitive category. And then also the value proposition, which is a little bit more feature centric. So where the positioning might be consumer focused and it's a little bit more about the benefit to the consumer, the value proposition is a little bit more about the features and the specifics, the function that you offer to deliver the value. So that's sort of typically what would come out of a brand strategy engagement. And then if you're a little bit further down the timeline of the work, it's often sort of starting with positioning and leading to either creative concepts or just a messaging hierarchy. So it might be sort of the positioning sitting on top of everything. And this is sort of how you want everyone to think about you. And then what are the 3 to 5 main messages that you're going to put out into the marketplace? And then you'll have support points for each one. So an engagement.
So I'm a brand, and the CEO, CTO, the C-levels have probably gone through the heavy lifting of figuring out some idea of sort of their mission and vision for the company. And as a marketer, as part of that brand, it's my job to essentially take that and go sell it in some fashion. So what you're starting to talk about is actually creating the messaging. And a lot of the times when we work with companies and clients, I don't quite know how they get to a lot of this stuff. I think that they probably work with their product team and they figure out, like you said, what features and what specs they sort of have available and what the product does, and then it's up to the marketers to then take that and get it into the hands of the clients. And I think that's where you come in really nicely, because you're sort of that bridge between what the product can do and how it's actually going to help a customer. I think a lot of the times as advertisers, myself included, we make assumptions and we say, well, this was created for this reason, and so this is what our client, this is what our customers are going to want. And then we just go out there and message it that way and it'll fail, and we don't always know why. And so by taking that step back and actually going, and what you do is actually go talk to customers and figure out how the messaging and the branding is going to resonate, right?
That's right. And so understanding the process probably helps to understand the output, and also some of the problems that people face. So one of the things that often happens is the client becomes very, very close to their product, and they're a little bit further removed from the customer and what they know, right? So as a client, as a person who makes a product or delivers a service, you have a really detailed understanding of your product. You might forget how little your target audience, your customer, your prospect, how little they know about what you offer and what you provide. So you might be starting at the latest and greatest features that you're really excited about, and you forget that the value that you provide more than anything else is the thing you actually started with in the very beginning. And you're continuing to hone it and make it better, but it's still the most important message, even though you have moved on. So the process typically would be, I would often come in and start by doing either one-on-one interviews or interviews with the entire department. But I'll talk to people in, a handful of people in sales, a handful of people in customer management or client management, and then any other discipline. So usually it would include a couple of folks from technology, and then the C-suite, or often it's founders and co-founders. And the goal of that is to understand how everyone sees the business, what they think is most compelling about the product, what their goals are, to make sure that everyone is aligned and see how the different teams are talking about the product, because those are all different ways that we can then evaluate when we go talk to customers. So when we go talk to customers, we might do qualitative or quantitative. We might do focus groups or one-on-one interviews with customers or prospects or people that the client has pitched but didn't win their business or didn't win them as a client, to understand who they chose and why. And then also quantitative work. So that would typically take the form of an online survey. And usually it's in that order. So usually we'll start with internal interviews, and then we'll do qualitative so that we can ask really open-ended questions to understand why they are or are not drawn to this product or this service, and also understand their needs, right? So what are they looking for and why? And then we go into the quantitative survey, because there we're starting to put words in their mouths, right? They can only sort of click answer options. So we want to gather as much learning as possible before we go into the quantitative survey.
And I want to back up 1 second, because I think it's so important to talk about what the customer needs. I think a lot of the times, and I think you're saying this too, you lead with this great feature you have and how excited you are about it, and you sort of lose why it exists. And so really digging into and actually sitting down and talking to your customers. I remember I was with you in the very first focus group I've ever been a part of. It was so cool to sit behind a glass and watch people interact with a product that they had never, that they, it was products they had actually used before, but to hear them talk about it and what they like about it and what they don't like about it, and to really have that understanding of what's important to them, and to start drawing, looking at the whole group and having them have different opinions too, and realizing that, we're obviously all human and we come with different needs, and then being able to segment that out, but really being able to hear the needs of the customer and being able to lead with that, I think is so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's real learning there too. So it can be inspiring for the organization to understand how you're really helping your customers and remembering that and staying close to them. And B, so by way of it, you can learn new things through the process. So by way of example, I recently did a project. I think you have a lot of tech listeners, so I'll talk about that category for a minute. Their product makes landlines textable. So typically this could be for small businesses, this could be for gyms, people that have appointments, but otherwise, either people have been using a personal phone or they've been using a landline, and people might know that phone number, but they have to call, and that's not necessarily convenient. And so they make that landline textable, and now customers can text and it shows up on the desktop. And they have so many features that they're excited about, right? You can look at timestamps for all the different things. You can aggregate all of the texting that comes in together. You can do mass sends to your customers to remind them of appointments and things like that. But when we did the research, what we heard was that more than anything else, the biggest benefit was that people could respond to customers from their computer, where that is their workstation and it's where they do most of their work. So we had moved past that because there were all these new features that were really important to customers that are already customers of this client. But we went all the way back to basics to say, oh, wow, this is the basic benefit that people have. It lets them get off their device. It lets them, not be distracted when they're trying to talk to a customer in person, and they can do their work on their computer where all the rest of their work flows. And so that became a big part of the story and the message when they're talking to potential clients.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you lead with that in terms of the challenge solution, right? And also the
That's
differentiator of them versus competitors being essentially a mobile device and being able to text on a mobile device. It's so easy to understand. I think that's something else that's sort of really hard with some tech companies, especially, is what they're selling is so complex. And so how do you break down into something so simple, right? I can imagine when the client initially talked to you and explained what they do, it sounded really technical in terms of being able to text to a landline, and then all of a sudden your head exploding, like, well, how does that even work? And at the end of the day, it comes down to, you can basically send a text from your computer. Like, oh, okay.
That's exactly right. And that's why the first stage is important, because it's important that the clients know that I have immersed myself in their business and I understand the complexities of how everything works, so that when we get to the end and the answer is something that seems simple, and at the end, it seems simple and intuitive, and you're amazed how much work it takes to get something simple and intuitive. And I often will work with a copywriter as a partner at the end of the project to see if we can make something even simpler and tighter by applying sort of that creative lens that sometimes can make something pithier, but still very clear and concise. And one thing I want to pick up on, because you mentioned it, so understanding the consumer need is extremely important. So typically when I'm doing this research, I'm thinking about three things. Sometimes there's a fourth. And the three things are the brand and what is authentic to the brand. And the internal interviews are a key part of that. What's relevant or appealing or interesting to the customer. And that's what we're doing all the qualitative and quantitative work around. And some of that we want to be open and inspired by the customer. And some of that we want to draw on what we've learned from the internal interviews, what they think, what the client thinks is the most compelling, but also leave the customer room to add something that we hadn't thought of before. And then the third thing, which you mentioned and I want to pick up on, is differentiating. What we end up talking about needs to stand out. Not everything has to stand out. Some things might be table stakes and still really important, but you need something that makes you different and stands out. And sometimes that's a product feature, sometimes it's a part of the service, sometimes it's a customer guarantee, and sometimes it's just the brand position and the personality itself. So those are the three things that we're typically looking for: brand, what's relevant to the customer, and what's differentiated or what stands out. And so as a part of that, we'll often do a competitive analysis to look at how competitors are talking about themselves, what features they're offering, and we'll also ask customers their perceptions of both our client and competitor brands to understand how aware or unaware they are and what they know about them and think of them.
So this might be a question that's too in the weeds, and you can tell me whether this makes sense or not. But something that really comes to mind is, obviously, talking internally is not a big deal. You can source the people. That's especially, I love how you said, talking to the different business units as well, right? Because they're going to be talking about the product differently than the sales team versus the marketing team versus the C-suite team might all be talking about the product totally differently than what the customers might need. But once you break out of that, you did mention talking to existing clients, which I think is also relatively easy to do. Talking to people who may not have bought your product, right? So these are contacts you already sort of the clients will already sort of have. But what about brand new prospects that may have never heard of this brand at all? How do you get in front of those people, or do you need to?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It is a little bit in the weeds, but I'm happy to talk about it. So basically, there are the short version is I work with sample providers, people who manage panels of people, to find the right audience. So if you're looking to speak with, moms 30 to 54, there will be panels that know that information about people already. It's a whole different industry that basically uses data from all different sources. So it might be information that they're tracking from pixels on websites, which I know you are probably familiar with, but also they're buying and trading lists with each other. So no one ever reads all those terms and services, but if you join a rewards program or a loyalty program and things like that, people are getting added to panels that way. And a lot of people have opted in and they receive rewards for participating in surveys and things like that. If you're doing qualitative, focus group facilities will often offer recruitment in their areas, and they know their communities well. So they have lists and panels and things that they can call people from. But people in the neighborhood or in their area are usually accessible to them. And then there are other approaches too. So if an audience is too hard to find on a general panel, then you might go to publication lists. So, Better Home and Garden will rent you their list of subscribers for $5,000. And so you have permission to access their list and send their subscribers an email or be included in their newsletter or something like that. And they'll offer targeting sometimes as well. And another way might be doing advertising on Facebook or Amazon or Instagram, and you can advertise your survey and recruit people that way. That's also often how people are recruited to the panels in the first place. So those are the weeds. But the short version is there are panel providers that are partners of mine, and I'll reach out to them and they'll offer bids to provide us with the sample that we're looking for to our specifications.
Yeah, I think that's really important to know, just like where, when we're talking about, especially tech companies and complex tech companies, finding the right audience is always sort of this question mark. It's getting easier, I think, with digital marketing and advertising, because you can sort of profile people that have already bought your product, and then you can use systems to then go find more people that sort of look like that person. So I definitely think it's sort of this question of like, well, if I want to hear from customers I've never heard from before, then how do I even remotely get in front of them to, ask these really important questions to understand if I'm even providing them, a service that they didn't even know that they needed. So thank you for diving into the weeds with me on that one. And pulling back up, I think the overarching question that I have, and I really didn't understand the power of this until, like I said, I saw it firsthand and working with you a few years ago, we worked, just so the listeners know, Steve and I worked on a product for, it was a new speaker that was potentially going to come out. I'm not sure what happened with it, but essentially the idea was they wanted to understand, was this even a need? And were people even looking for this type of speaker? And so we pulled together a focus group. We did it over 2 nights, I think, and it was multiple folk. It was probably 3 or 4 groups that we had come in. And it was just really cool to see it in person and to see the power of it. So when you're talking to people who've like, oh, I never even thought to do research on my product, like, why is this so important and why should people consider it? And at what point in the stage of them putting together their sort of marketing materials should they bring in this understanding and this kind of research?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, when I'm working with a much smaller organization, I would often steer them to trust their instincts for the time being. If they really have limited dollars, to some extent, formal research is a luxury because it isn't necessarily totally inexpensive if you're really strapped for cash. But once you started hiring and you're building your organization, research is going to be one of your best friends. And some people have folks in-house that can help with this, managing partners and managing projects, but research can help in a lot of different ways. I mean, one of the most important, I would say, is the message, what we've spent a lot of time on. I think you really want to make sure that internally people are speaking the same language and aligned in mission and how they're talking about the product. And they really want to be empathetic to and understand the customer and the value that you provide. I think that gives people a lot of pride in the company that they work for, and it makes everybody a better salesperson. And it keeps people aligned in how they're talking about the product. But research is important in a lot of ways, and it can be used in a lot of different ways. So the message is one, and the brand strategy and creating that messaging hierarchy. Measurement is another. So Kerry, I know that you and Mike do a lot of analytics and data and sort of tracking that. And I can tell you a lot, and it can actually tell you a lot more than it used to be able to. Sometimes I think it can start to tell you the why behind the what, but for the most part, you're observing behavior. And that's really valuable. Often it's just in your own ecosystem, but that is really useful. So one of the other things that research often does is it provides brand tracking or ad tracking. So if you're running an advertising campaign, you might measure brand metrics before and after you field the advertising. And then you'll measure awareness of the advertising itself to see how effectively it's reaching the marketplace and what people are perceiving. And brand tracking is similar. Once companies grow to a certain size, typically they're going to be doing brand tracking at least once a year. And they're going to monitor key measures along the funnel and along personality attributes. So they're going to want to understand how many people are aware of me, familiar with me. Do they think of me as a leader in the category? Do I have momentum? Am I on my way up, or am I sort of fading in value and importance? And are they considering me? How interested in using me are they, or have they ever used me? So brand tracking, and then you watch that over time to see how your marketing and your efforts and your media and everything else, PR, how all of those things are affecting your brand tracking. And you can sort of see what's happening in the category. And then one of the other things that I've actually been doing, this gives startups a big bang for their buck. You can use research to create original content. So you might want to be seen as a leader in your industry. And so you conduct a study. It often follows the same pattern. I'll start with internal interviews and then qualitative and then quantitative. But the goal, the output, is actually intended to be used as content. So you might gather a couple of key stats and you release them one at a time in your social media feed over the course of a year. Or you might write a white paper or a couple white papers, right? You might explore 4 to 5 different topics that you think would be of interest in your industry or to your buyer. And then you might release a couple blog posts or white papers over the year and try to push PR behind those things. You might speak at conferences and you have your own point of view and your own data, and you're positioning yourself as a leader in the space or as an expert. and knowledgeable in the space, so that you then have a reason to be there. And you're basically providing value to your prospective customers and clients before it gives them a reason to talk to you, right? And so I've been doing quite a bit of that lately as well, especially among tech startups, because they're hungry for content to sort of be out there generating leads.
Yes, content is definitely still king, I would say, in terms of generating leads, putting something really powerful out there, but also really useful. And I think what's nice about doing the research ahead of time and finding sort of that nugget of what are people missing and being able to sort of tie that together into what is then created just adds, you're filling a gap, right? So there's so much content already out there, but what's missing for people and what isn't being talked about and what questions do they have? And then, understanding that up front. I think a lot of times when you talked about analytics, and analytics is definitely a huge part of everything that we do. And it's why Mike and I started our company, is because you have to know what the outcomes are and what your campaigns are actually doing in terms of producing you revenue. You don't know how your campaigns are doing, and if they're actually producing revenue, then what are you doing and why are you doing it? But the reason why research is so different and adds another layer of that is because you can do it up front, right? Analytics is so after the fact. You have to run the campaign to see how it's going to perform, and then you can make adjustments as you go, or big sweeping changes once you have a bigger picture of the analytics. And it's after. Research can happen before. Research can happen before you launch a single dollar into the world. You can get, put that foot forward in a much more powerful way, and especially with content, because you can know that what you're putting out to the world is actually something people need.
That's right. And, you can do, in the digital world, you might do A/B testing and things like that, but you don't necessarily get the power of one voice, and that can be really powerful, right? So as an example, we'll never know because we stopped it in advance, but so sometimes, once you're a larger organization, you're doing lots of media, lots of paid media, you're often going to do evaluation research as a part of developing the creative content. So you'll do focus groups and things like that to see what people think of the advertising. You might even do quantitative testing as well. And the real value there, you sort of saw it being behind the glass. You see the nuances and you can see the value in one voice. So we were doing an ad and it had nothing to do with the product or anything, but part of the ad took place in a taxi cab. And in the image that we were using to show what the taxi cab looks like, there was a little icon of a Hindu god on the cab countertop. And, that isn't necessarily a big deal, but one person noticed. And, I don't know that would have created some sort of PR or something or other, but it is the kind of thing where it's like, oh, one voice can see a thing that could become a bigger thing out in the marketplace. And you're looking for just these little red flags, things that just occur to people, because if they're not key to the product or to the concept or something like that, it's really easy to resolve before it becomes an issue.
I think that's the key factor here is before. There's so much you can learn before you spend any advertising dollars and really understand your audience ahead of time. I think is just so cool and powerful. And this has been awesome, Steve. Thank you so much for joining me. I love talking to you. We should do this more just for fun. And
we definitely should. I had a great time. Thank you.
So Liz, what was the one thing that really stuck with you from my conversation with Steve?
The one thing that I found really interesting was the company that developed the product to text to a landline. And the one thing that was most interesting, I think, was that the users in the focus group found it most convenient, or was their favorite part about it, was that they could respond to text messages on their computers, which wasn't, I mean, sure, this is a big part of the product, but wasn't probably the thing that the company thought about, the product development people thought about. But of course they did. I do too. Like, I would rather we're at a workstation, I would rather respond to everything in one place and not get distracted on my phone. But it was really, it was interesting to hear, and that was kind of what stuck out most to me.
Yeah, user groups are really cool. I actually got to sit on the other side of the glass and watch Steve at work in a focus group. They were looking at speakers, and just to hear from the users of like what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it, what was convenient, what wasn't, why the speaker, I think the whole point of the speaker was to be portable, and that's a thing and people care about that, was just shocking to me, because I never thought of like carrying like a music box around with me for people to be listening to music anywhere. So it is definitely really cool to see firsthand and to get those sort of nuggets, especially from, like we mentioned in the opening of writing that ad copy. I'm sure you always like to have new ideas up your sleeves, and this would certainly create some new opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, Liz, thanks for joining me today. This was a blast.
Thanks for having me. This is really fun.
If you listeners are interested in learning more about Do Feel Think or reaching out to Steve Kesselman, please visit dofeelthink.com. All one word, no periods. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Thank you, Liz, and I will talk to you soon.
Right. Thanks.